Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. I'm Charles Williams, and together we'll explore untold stories, bold ideas, and innovative approaches that transform our schools and communities. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. As always, thank you so much for being in this space. Now, I know my background looks a little bit different. I'm in a different space today, so it is okay. Things are fine. But still enjoying this new platform. So thank you again for joining. Whether you are watching the video or you're just simply listening as you're driving around, I am very excited for today's episode, because a while ago I had the opportunity to join a session focused on the work of Brené Brown. And I've mentioned in this podcast multiple times that up until that point, I really didn't know who she was. I've heard her name here and there. I knew that she had a massive fan base, but I really wasn't exposed until I went to this first session. And when I was there, I met this wonderful facilitator named Holly O'Hearn, and I was like, she's fantastic. And since then, we've been able to spend tons of time together as she's done workshops in my building, as we just hosted her, as she's done workshops with other leaders. And so finally, I've been able to get her into this space to have a conversation with me. So here we are today with the one and the only Holly O'Hearn. Holly, how are you doing today?
I'm so good. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I already feel that it's going to be fantastic.
As do I, yeah.
If any of these other conversations we've had are any indicators. So before I jump in, because I'm at a disadvantage, well, the listeners are, because I know you. We've been able to spend some time together. So why don't we kick things off? Tell us a little bit about who you are, the work that you do. I've already mentioned, Brené. So talk a little bit about that, any of the other work that you want to share, and maybe something interesting about yourself that maybe not a lot of people know. I'm very curious because maybe there's something I don't know.
I'll do that at the end so I can figure out. It's like when you order off of a menu and you make a game time decision. That'll be my fun fact. I've worked in some DEI spaces, so I'm going to bring some of my DEI stuff to my introduction because there's a lot of things I like to practice. My name is Holly O'Hearn. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, and one of the things I like to practice is doing a visual introduction, just in case anyone isn't able to see what we look like for whatever reason, including the people who might only be listening in their cars or whatever, right? So I'm a white woman with long red hair, and I'm in a home office kind of setting with books and plants behind me, and the plants are real. Sometimes I get that question. I finally learned how to grow plants and keep them alive in the pandemic, which was not something I was able to do any time in my life before that. So that's a newer development in my life. I spent 19 years in corporate America. And then the last 2.5 years, I've been working for myself full time. I guess the trendy term is solopreneur. So I'm a solopreneur and I do leadership development workshops, which is similar to what I was doing in corporate America. I was always embedded within like a learning and development team or a training team or some arm of that. And there were always themes of leadership development. There were always themes of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, the many other words that go along with that work. I have a lot of passion around mental health. So I would say that is something I've worked on my own. I've been in therapy for years and years, but I like to bring mental health into the workplace as well too, and into leadership. So now that I work for myself, it's not all corporate, as you well know. So I work with many different kinds of organizations and small, little, nonprofit, all the different things. And I'm just trying to help people with their own goals based on the background that I have. I can talk more about the Brené work as we chat, but I'm a certified Dare to Lead facilitator, and I was trained by Brené and her team in March 2019 to do that particular part of the work that I do. And then I run other programs that I've developed as well. So it's sort of a combination of things. And fun fact, I haven't told people this in a while. I engaged in a tournament for do you know the game Sudoku with the numbers?
I do.
So I won a Sudoku tournament probably like 18 years ago, back when everyone was still like reading newspapers on their commute to work, and there was a Sudoku challenge in Chicago's Red Eye newspaper.
Ah,
And I went on their radio show, and they had me do a Sudoku smack talk, like sports thing before we went into the game, and then I beat the guy who was the regular. So I still have like an old clipping from this newspaper that I'll probably send you later.
yeah, that's awesome. I love Red Eye. I haven't read one of those in forever, but I
Yeah.
remember always picking those up. And yeah, my first introduction to Sudoku, I was on a plane with my brother. I think we were going to Vegas because I had won some script writing competition for The Sopranos, which is a whole nother story.
Oh, cool.
But I
Some back.
remember he was working on it and he was explaining it to me, and I was like, "Oh, so like you put a seven right there?" And he's like, "No, no, you can't just throw a no, a seven does go there." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I think I got it." And he was like, "Ah." But now I love it. And every single morning is part of the New York Times games. That's one of the things that I play every single morning. So wonderful.
It's
Now,
we have that in common. It's good
yeah.
mental gymnastics, and honestly, I'll say the philosophy of it I've brought into my work, because a lot of times when I get stuck, I decide to just come at it from a different angle. And
Hmm.
so I'll pick a different number than the one that I was working on. I'm like, okay, I'm going to leave sevens alone. I'm stuck on sevens. Let me find the nines. And that's helped me when I've been stuck in different times in leadership things and working with other people, is like, why don't we try it from like another angle or whatever, or put it down and pick it up again tomorrow and maybe it'll go better, So I didn't mean to tie that in, but I do feel like the thought process behind it I use in a lot of ways. Yeah.
I love that. Holly, I think there's maybe a potential breakout session for a conference. So I'll tie your name to it. I'll throw it out there. We'll see what happens.
I love that.
So obviously I'm familiar with some of the work that you do, right? All the Dare to Lead. That's the stuff we've connected. I know that you're doing all of this other work. And so I'm very curious, as we're connecting today, what is it that you want to dive into? Is it a combination of things? What topic? I'll let you choose and we'll go from there.
Yeah. And thanks for seeing the bigger picture. A lot of times, all of us, we tend to know just that snapshot that we've seen of a human. And each of us is a lot more than that, right? So
Absolutely.
people who have done DEI training usually just think I'm only a DEI trainer. People who have seen me do Brene Brown stuff think I'm only a Brene Brown person. And like, we contain multitudes, right? So yeah, I just did a lunch and learn on mental health in the workplace. I did a session for another company about grief at work recently. I'm developing something on intergenerational teams, because sometimes, there's a lot that a team could be making the most of that they're not because of age differences, et cetera. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot that I have going on as I work for myself. And I didn't mention my company's name, which is part of this too.
Mhm.
So my company is called Regime Change. And I've been told it's an interesting company name or a bold company name. I've gotten a lot of opinions on it, but I love it because I find that the people who are attracted to work with me are the people who want to be the change that they want to see in leadership spaces or other spaces. It's part of why I was so excited about your podcast, is because you're challenging narratives and you're shifting things that maybe people have only seen a certain way. And I think that that's what can be done in leadership. Is some of us have had good leaders, some of us have maybe not had the kind of leaders we wanted, but we can still choose to be the kind of leaders that people around us can benefit from. So, I mean, it's all related. I'd say the main theme, and it's the thing I think you and I could talk a lot about, that sort of like punctuates all of my workers, like a through line, you could say, is that you do have to take care of yourself before you can do anything for anyone else. And I'm sure you've talked about this in different ways. I've listened to some of your podcasts, so I bet this goes in line well with some other things. Is like, I think you tend to think as a human, to help someone else, you have to focus on them first or fully, et cetera. But actually, we've got to take care of ourselves. And so that could be managing our emotions. That could be just like saying what we need or asking for an adjustment in how things are going in communication, in conflict, or whatever. But that takes courage, right? So I'd say like courage is another through line as well too. But yeah, just like it can seem counterintuitive, but actually, if there's a lot of quotes. Of course, everyone likes the like oxygen on the plane analogy.
Mhm.
There's more of a more like poetic like quote that I'm probably like adjusting on my own, but it's, you cannot give from an empty well. and like you cannot give water from an empty well, right? And so
Right.
that's sort of the concept that I think is a theme that I get really excited about talking about.
No, this is actually one of my favorite topics, especially I would say within the last year or so. It's something that I've really leaned into. And, in full transparency and vulnerability, I've said this before that when I first started having conversations, when I first started doing this work, it was also a topic. But it
Mm.
wasn't a topic that I was actually living. It was a topic that I talked about because I knew it was important. I knew that it was popular and I knew that it would gain interest and views and things like that. But to be honest, when I left that space, I wasn't practicing much of what I was talking about.
Mm.
And within the last 2 years or so, I've really have leaned into it, right? I'm doing the PLC now for Chicago Leaders, which is now for the state of Illinois as well. So like very excited about that. But really, really leaning into it. And it makes me think of an interview that I read a while ago. Now I know the
Mm.
figures are a little controversial, but they were talking to Will and Jada. And they were like, hey, in what order do you prioritize? And I remember Will saying, well, me, then Jada, then the kids. And Jada was very upset. And she's like,
Mm.
like, what are you talking about? Like, how dare you? That's
Mm.
so selfish. And he says, no, no, no. I have to put me first because if I can't take care of me, then I can't be there for you and the kids. And then I put you second, not because you're more valuable than the kids, but we need to be okay in order to take care of them. Right. And so it shifted a perspective for me as I started thinking about that. And I think, as you were mentioning, is that it does tend to push back against what we consider the norm. But in reality, when we pause and we think about it, it makes sense because we can't, right? And like you, one of my favorite quotes is it's from August Wilson. It's like, you've got to be right with yourself before you can be right with anyone else. And
Yeah.
there's so much hard work that we have to do before we can do that hard work. But I think so many times we just jump in and then we wonder why we're not making that progress. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I think as you're thinking about this, right? And obviously you've done this work. How do you see it showing up and manifesting in spaces, even though we know this very popular, right? This is not a new conversation, and yet here we are having it because it needs to be had. Like why do you think that is?
Oh, well, I mean, first of all, I think systems are not designed for it and they don't reinforce it. And so a lot of us are also working against systems around us.
Mhm.
I'd say also because it takes courage, and we all have access to courage differently each and every single day, and the situations might, you never know when your situation you're in might activate some things within you where you don't have full access to the decision making part of your brain, right? My favorite thing, and it's in Dare to Lead and it's in other things as well, is I feel like I'm continually building a healthy toolbox, but I have to remember that the healthy toolbox is there. And I forget that it's there during times when I'm particularly activated, right? And so it takes courage to pause. It takes courage to consider other choices and then remember what those choices even are. It takes courage to be a little messy while you're learning how to do that, right? Like what I love about like what that interview just described is it sounds like a very human interaction they were having publicly, right?
Right.
And that's a lot of what I'm talking about with this work with leadership is like it takes courage to try something new because I'm not going to be perfect at it and I might get flustered or my face might turn red or I might, like all these things where that's actually what people want to see from us. They want to see us taking care of ourselves even when it's hard.
Mm.
But it's so easy to skip over that and be how we were taught of like, oh, I'm going to move into polished mode now, or I'm going to pretend nothing's happening, even though something clearly is happening. Right. And so, like, how can we be more human rather than try to be robots, even though a lot of systems want us to be robots? And this is not a whole conversation about robotics. I don't mean, you know what I mean? But just that idea of being like, something other than a messy human, which we all are messy humans. And the more we're messy humans with each other, the more it gives other permission to be messy humans too. And then actually more things are possible.
I love the idea that you had said in there about the toolbox, right?
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think we're very good about acquiring tools, right? Especially in the field of ed, right? We're always acquiring, there's always something new. and then we put it away, and then we default, right, to those things that we're comfortable with, those things that we know. And in our spaces like we're talking about right now, a lot of that, I think, is, you're right, we it's that polished look, right? Especially as for me as a school leader, when we have loss in the building, I've shared that back in May we lost a student, right?
Yeah.
I don't always have that luxury or the freedom to say I'm going to express this right now, right? We've recently lost a staff member, right? And I'm thinking, how am I going to present myself to my staff, my students, my families, because they're looking at us in a certain way. And so you're right. We have a toolbox, and we have to be aware of the things that are in that toolbox to say, what can I utilize? Right. And it takes that courage, because we are pushing back against the system.
Yeah.
Maybe we let some of that vulnerability through, and it's something that we're not always accustomed to. Recently I shared with one of the other assistant principals in the building. And I told him, I said, listen, I know typically, like, I stand up, I'm like, there, I've got this. I'm like, when it comes to death, though, I don't have it. Like, this is not an area where I'm strong. I need to take a step back and let others step forward. And he just kind of
Mm.
looked at me and he was like, I think this is the first time I've ever heard you say, like, I can't, right? And just stepping back. And so you're right. I had to dig into that toolbox, right? This from the Brene thing, right? I had to consider
Yeah.
some of the armor that I had put on and
Yeah.
say, hey, wait a minute, let me be vulnerable in this space. And so I'm just curious, as you've done some of this work, how have you seen, or have you seen anybody making those transformations? Or maybe it's a personal story of saying, you know what, I'm going to dig into that toolbox, right? I'm not going to present that polished piece. I'm going to live in that space of vulnerability, right? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting on some levels, at least for me, life eventually forces it. Like, and it actually, grief is a big part of it for me, is and by the way, thanks for sharing that story. And as a fun fact, you probably built trust in that moment. It's funny, a lot of times when we tell people something we can't do, even if even if that's not what they expect us to say, we inherently trust people who tell us what they can and can't do, right? Because so many people say they can and then they do something badly, and or when we say we don't know, people trust us more. But it takes courage to do those things too. For me, I've had a variety of moments of grief in my life. But I'd say a big one that impacted me in the workplace was I was going through a divorce, and I was in deep grief about this divorce, and I was very aware. I didn't even have a choice of how I was showing up, because I I didn't have the capacity to be the bright, shiny, like smiley, laughy person I'd always been. I couldn't have forced that, right? And I noticed that people engaged with me differently, and it where I thought that might be a problem is actually I ended up making many more connections during that time. And I could be wrong, but what I think happened, the story I make up, is that people were like, "Oh, she's real." Like, you know what I mean? Like, where I thought that I'd been projecting an authentic image, I maybe was being too polished or too positive all the time before that. Where this other side of me, people are like, "Oh, she's got it. She actually knows what messy is too," or whatever it is. And so I think I just will always remember that, is the times where you think showing up a different way is going to be a problem and it's not. It it like encourages you to do it again. In fact, I'm going to not say this as scientifically as I could, but studies show the more work we do on ourselves, the more neural pathways get created in our brain. And so when I do leadership training or Brene Brown training, et cetera, I often will say, like, the good news is if we practice this stuff, we create more neural pathways, and slowly it can become a muscle memory. Um, it's not going to at first it's going to take a lot of effort, which is why practice helps, because the more we practice it, the better. But eventually it will become something you can do without choosing it. And so that's how I think about any of my healthy toolbox stuff, is remind myself, like, it's okay if it's messy as I try out this. And I can even say, I'm practicing something, or I'm trying something, or I I'm still figuring out how to say this. So let me know if I could say it better, right? Then you're inviting people to call you in, even if it's like, let me know if I didn't use inclusive terminology, or let me know if I'm not seeing something because of my own power and privilege in society. Like, it's like you're inviting people in to help you with your work. And when you have people you trust, you can even say, would you let me know if you ever see me do X, Y, and Z? Because that'll let me know that I forgot my toolbox or whatever. So anyway, there was a bunch of answers, but those are some things that come to mind with what you asked.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate all those things. And again, for, having that space of vulnerability here as well. Like I'm as we're talking about this, I'm sure that people are listening and saying, "Yeah, this sounds good, right? We've heard these things before. We need to show up. We need to be transparent. We need to be vulnerable, right?" And one, I would always caution to a point, like you don't have to show up to work and just spill everything, right? That's not what we're talking about here. But it is being about being honest about who you are and how you're showing up, and I think more so, not just to others or for others, but for yourself, right? And saying, hey, I'm going to do this work, and be in the process, maybe some of those things are coming out. As an example, I never celebrated my birthday. It was just a weird thing. I think some of it was a little self beating up, like maybe you don't deserve to do these things.
Mm.
And so this year, however, after a very long time and after a lot of convincing from others, I'm actually taking a trip. So as of the recording of this, my birthday is the following week. And so we're taking a trip, going out of town. And that was something I never did. I'd show up to work on my birthday, you know, treated it like any other day. And people are like, that's so weird. Why are you like that? Right. And so I've recognized, and I like to say, hey, it's okay. Right. It's okay to step away from work. The building and all the work is still going to be there when I get back. It's okay to take care of myself and to treat myself. Like I've worked very hard to get to this point, and I think growing up that was never something that we really did, right? And so now it feels a little bit different, and so that's something I'm exploring, and it's not for anybody else except for myself. So I'm leaning into that. So I'm curious then, as we're talking about this, those people who are watching, those who are listening and saying, Charles, Holly, I hear you, but I don't know what to do. How do I even begin this journey, right? Do you have any ideas, tips, strategies of how they could begin? Whether it's a book, whether it's a podcast, whether it's an activity. I know you have a ton of approaches that people could lean into. So any suggestions how somebody can begin this journey of taking care of themselves?
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if this has been a theme elsewhere in your podcast before, is I would say pick one new way to get involved in your community,
Hmm.
because it will give back to you also, right? But also, and people may not want to do it when they hear me say this, but it may activate a new trigger for you. I don't like to use the word trigger, but I don't have a different word here. I guess it gets you out of your comfort zone is more what it really is. But like I'll give an example. So I do a lot of work with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless here in Chicago, although they just changed their name. They're now the Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness, because they were told there are some things that could be more inclusive about their name over time, and they listed and they changed. It's still the acronym CCH, which I'll use from now on. But first of all, I've learned a lot of racial equity work from them. I was on their associate board. Now I'm on their board of directors, and we go through racial equity training together with the staff members every year. And that's been a lot of ways that I've both invested in myself, but I've also seen new things in myself to take care of, because things that were happening different than my day jobs were happening in this work, right? And I was meeting different people from different lived experience, et cetera. And so it just would like highlight areas of like, oh, this is something I've never thought about. Let me take care of myself so I can do better work here, right? Even things I've learned about like trauma informed spaces and making space, like, any space that you're in a little more trauma informed, was a Chicago area workshop I went through that caused me to both invest in myself, but then realize areas I needed to invest in myself more. And for me, and I guess it could be different on each of our own value sets, but part of how I take care of myself is to engage and to find connections in community. And studies show that connection is really important to humans. We all just do it a little differently, right? And so I'd say for me, that's been a really nourishing area. And it's also, been an area that's made me like who I am, because it's helped me be more well-rounded.
I love that. The idea of saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to work on myself. And in that process, right, I'm being able to give back. I'm being able to pour into a space that will ultimately impact me anyway. And so, you mentioned the idea of connections, and it's really important for us as humans, as people, to have those spaces. So I'm glad that you were able to find a way to connect. And thank you again for sharing. I'm like, as we're talking, I was like, oh, I'm learning more about Holly. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And all the work that you're doing. So I'm curious, then, as we close this out, right? Those of you listening, Holly shared with you, find ways to connect with others, right? Whether that's going and joining and doing some work within your community, whether it's finding like-minded individuals, where
Yeah.
she mentioned earlier the idea of saying, hey, I need accountability partners, somebody that's going to hold me accountable for making sure that I am taking care of myself, right? All of these pieces, right? Because one of my staff members told me that he shared a piece of wisdom, I guess, if you will. When I shared, I really don't do anything for my birthday. He was like, oh, you don't? Wait until you miss one.
Mm.
It was like, oh, huh. Like just a short little thing, right? But had I not shared that, right? Had we not had that connection, who knows? Who knows? So I appreciate you sharing that. You've shared a lot of pieces about all the work that you're doing, in Chicago and beyond. So if somebody were watching or listening and they wanted to bring Holly into their space to do some work with their organization, or they're just like, I want to connect and learn more because she seems like a fabulous individual who has learned how to grow plants, because we still haven't figured that piece out and I just rely on plastic ones. How can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Um, I just really appreciate how you did a beautiful circle back there. Thank you for that. I mean, LinkedIn is a great way. I'm on LinkedIn. And then also I have a website and it's regimechange.co. And I'm still in the mode of, do I want to get on other socials for my business? But right now, yeah, LinkedIn or my website are best. I'm sure we can link to those. And yeah, I guess I'd add, I do in-person workshops and I also do virtual workshops. Actually, I love both equally, and I do a really good virtual workshop, which I know a lot of people are kind of burned out on those, and that they're not always engaging. Mine are good. So I really do like both mediums. And yeah, I like small groups, large groups. I do keynotes and panels, but I also really love designing custom workshops. So it's kind of a variety of things, but I love to hear what the need is from people and have us like co-collaborate for what that need is that I could help with. So yeah, that's a good start anyway to get a hold of me.
Well, man, I appreciate you sharing. And those of you watching or listening, as somebody who has spent time and actually had the opportunity, they were like, hey, do you want to rejoin a session? And I was like, yeah. Right. And so jumping back in and spending time, voluntarily, willingly spending time with her, I can tell you that Holly is phenomenal. And so if you have a chance to connect, definitely do so. Holly, I just want to say thank you, right? One, for obviously being on this show and reconnecting with me here in this space. But more importantly, I want to say thank you just for all of the amazing work that you do right here in Chicago and beyond, in the space of ed and beyond, because I think that you're making a really big, a really impactful space. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, right back at you. That means a lot. And I see the work that you're doing. And honestly, a number of people I've gotten to know through the workshops that brought us together, of just the life-changing work that happens in Chicago. And I know in other cities all the time. And it takes all of us connecting to make more and more of that possible. So thank you for being a connector and for your courage as well, too. Yeah.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Listeners, viewers, thank you again for joining us here for this episode. And as always, until next time.